On the frozen morning of January 15, 2003, in a quiet subdivision outside Fort Collins, Colorado, a father placed a call that would shake a community to its core. His voice trembled as he reported his 5-year-old daughter missing from their modest 2-story home on Willow Creek Drive. Within hours, search teams would comb through snow-dusted fields and frozen riverbanks. Within days, investigators would begin to notice something they couldn't ignore: the small inconsistencies, the peculiar timeline, the father's strangely rehearsed answers. But it would take 20 years, a whisper from the past, and one determined cold case detective to finally answer the question that haunted everyone who remembered that winter. What really happened to Emma Rose Harrison? Fort Collins sits at the edge of the Colorado Plains, where the land begins its slow climb toward the Rocky Mountains. In 2003, the city carried the dual identity of college town and family community, a place where old ranching families lived alongside university professors and young professionals seeking mountain views and good schools. The neighborhood sprawled outward from the historic downtown, subdivisions with names like Meadowbrook and Prairie Ridge spreading across former farmland. Willow Creek was one of these developments, built in the late 1990s. Homes painted in muted earth tones with 2-car garages and small front yards where children's bikes lay against garage doors and basketball hoops stood sentry over driveways. Michael Harrison was 32 years old that winter, a telecommunications technician who had moved to Colorado from Nebraska 5 years earlier. He stood just under 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair he kept short, the kind of man neighbors would describe later as quiet, polite, someone who waved from his driveway but rarely stopped to chat. His wife, Jennifer, was 29, a part-time dental hygienist with dark blonde hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. They had 2 children: Emma Rose, 5 years old, with her mother's blue eyes and a gap-toothed smile captured in dozens of photographs that would later circulate on news broadcasts, and Jacob, who was 3, still learning to pronounce his R's correctly. The house on Willow Creek Drive was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with beige siding and brown trim, indistinguishable from a dozen others on the same street. Inside, the rooms were neat but lived-in, crayon drawings affixed to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets, a basket of toys in the corner of the living room, family photos arranged on the mantel above a gas fireplace. January 14, 2003, unfolded like countless days before it. Jennifer worked the early shift at the dental office, leaving the house at 6:45 while the sky was still dark and Michael got the children ready for daycare. Emma attended morning preschool 3 days a week, but that Tuesday was not one of those days. She stayed home with her father, who had taken the day off work. According to the timeline Michael Harrison would provide to investigators later that day, the morning proceeded normally. Emma had cereal for breakfast, Cheerios with sliced banana, her favorite. She wore purple corduroy pants and a pink sweatshirt with a cartoon character on the front. Jacob played with blocks on the living room floor while Emma watched a television program about talking animals. Michael said he did laundry, folded clothes, checked email on the family's desktop computer in the small office off the hallway. Around 10:30 in the morning, he told detectives he put Jacob down for his nap in the children's shared bedroom. Emma, he said, asked to go outside and play on the swing set in the backyard. The temperature that morning hovered around 28 degrees. Patches of snow from a storm 3 days earlier still clung to the shaded areas of yards and beneath pine trees. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, the kind of winter morning where everything seems sharper, clearer, sounds carrying farther in the cold, dry air. Michael said he watched Emma through the sliding glass door that opened from the kitchen onto a small concrete patio. He said he could see her swinging, her purple coat bright against the brown fence that enclosed the backyard. He said he turned away to put dishes in the dishwasher. When he looked up again, he would tell investigators Emma was gone. The timeline from this point becomes precise because fear makes people precise. Michael said he checked his watch, 11:07. He slid open the glass door and called Emma's name. The swing hung still, moving slightly in a breeze too faint to feel. He walked across the small yard, calling louder now. The gate in the fence was closed but not latched. Michael later told police he never latched it because the metal catch was stiff and the children struggled with it. He opened the gate and stepped into the open space behind the houses, a greenbelt area with scattered cottonwood trees and tall dead grass poking through snow. He called Emma's name again and again, his voice echoing back at him from the empty field. Clear's throat. At 11:14, according to phone records that would be examined and re-examined in the months to come, Michael Harrison called his wife at the dental office. The receptionist who answered remembered his voice as urgent but controlled. Jennifer came to the phone immediately. The conversation lasted 42 seconds. She would later recall every word, every pause. "I can't find Emma," Michael said. "She was in the backyard and now I can't find her." Jennifer told him to call the police. She hung up and grabbed her coat, not bothering to explain to her supervisor, just running for her car. Michael's call to emergency services came at 11:16. The recording, preserved in case files, captures his voice with remarkable clarity. "My daughter is missing. She was in the backyard and I came outside and she's not here. I've looked everywhere. I need someone to help me find her." The dispatcher asked standard questions: age, description, clothing, how long she had been missing. Michael answered each question precisely. Too precisely, some would later observe. His breathing was rapid, but his words came out measured, almost rehearsed. When the dispatcher asked if there were any places Emma might have gone on her own, any neighbors she might have visited, Michael said no. She wouldn't do that. She knew the rules about staying in the yard. The first patrol car arrived at 11:28. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped out into the cold morning and immediately noticed Michael Harrison standing in the driveway, his arms wrapped around himself, his face pale. No coat, Reeves would note later in his report. The man had been searching for his missing daughter in 28-degree weather and hadn't put on a coat. Reeves asked Michael to describe what happened. As Michael explained about the swing, the dishwasher, the open gate, Reeves found himself struck by the father's composure. Upset, certainly, but not frantic. Not the way Reeves expected a parent to be when a 5-year-old had vanished. By noon, 6 patrol cars lined Willow Creek Drive. Jennifer Harrison arrived home at 12:10, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the front door. She ran through the house calling Emma's name, checking closets, looking under beds, even though officers had already searched every room. She collapsed sobbing in the doorway of the children's bedroom where Jacob still slept, undisturbed by the commotion. Michael stood behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe, his expression difficult to read. The search expanded outward in concentric circles. Officers walked through neighboring yards, knocked on doors, asked residents if they had seen a little girl in purple pants and a pink sweatshirt. No one had. The green belt behind the houses was searched methodically, officers moving in a line through the frozen grass. They found a tennis ball, a faded soda can, a child's sock that was the wrong size and color. Across the field, a drainage ditch ran parallel to a service road. The water in the ditch was shallow, mostly frozen. Officers checked it carefully, breaking through ice with the heels of their boots, but found nothing. By 2 in the afternoon, the Larimer County Sheriff's Department had taken over the case. Detective Sarah Chen, a 12-year veteran with experience in missing person cases, arrived at the Harrison home and asked to speak with Michael and Jennifer separately. Jennifer went first, her interview taking place in the living room while Michael waited in the kitchen with a victim advocate. Jennifer's answers were fragmented, interrupted by crying, by questions of her own. Where is she? How is this possible? Someone must have taken her. Detective Chen asked about the morning routine, about who Emma knew, about any recent changes or stresses in the household. Jennifer said everything had been normal. A normal morning in a normal week. Nothing unusual at all. Michael's interview was different. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him, and walked Detective Chen through the timeline again. She listened, taking notes, and then asked him to repeat it. He did, using almost identical phrasing. Chen asked about the gate. Michael explained about the stiff latch, how he never fastened it completely. Chen asked if Emma had ever left the yard on her own before. Michael said no, never. Chen asked what Emma had been wearing on her feet. Michael paused for the first time, his eyes moving to the left as if visualizing the memory. Her boots, he said. The purple snow boots. Clear's throat. But when officers checked the mudroom off the garage, they found Emma's purple snow boots sitting neatly side by side on the mat with the other family shoes. The boots were dry, no snow or mud clinging to the treads. Detective Chen returned to the kitchen and asked Michael if he was certain Emma had been wearing boots when she went outside. Michael's face changed, just slightly, a tightening around his eyes. Maybe she was in her sneakers, he said. I'm not sure. I wasn't paying that close attention. Those who knew him said Michael Harrison had always been particular about details. His work colleagues described him as meticulous, someone who color-coded his schedule and kept his toolbox organized. His mother-in-law would tell investigators that Michael couldn't stand disorder, that he lined up the canned goods in the pantry with labels facing forward. Yet now, he couldn't remember what shoes his daughter had been wearing minutes before she disappeared. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temperature dropped. Search teams brought in floodlights. Volunteers from the community began arriving, people who had seen the alert on local news, parents who couldn't imagine standing by while a child was missing. They formed search lines and walked through parks and along the Powder River Trail. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the area. Search and rescue dogs were brought to the house and given Emma's pajamas to scent. They circled the backyard, noses to the ground, and then sat down, confused. The trail went nowhere. It simply ended at the gate, as if the child had evaporated into the frozen air. By midnight, more than 200 people had searched a 4-square-mile area around Willow Creek Drive. They had found nothing. Emma Rose Harrison had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all, leaving behind only a still swing, a pair of dry boots, and a father whose story was beginning to fracture at the edges. Part 2. The Investigation. Dawn on January 16 brought no relief, only a deeper cold and the grim awareness that a child had been missing for nearly 24 hours. The command post established in the Harrisons' driveway now included mobile units from the sheriff's department, FBI agents from the Denver field office, and volunteer coordinators managing the hundreds of people who continued to arrive, determined to help. The media presence had grown overnight. Satellite trucks from television stations in Denver and Cheyenne parked along the street, reporters doing stand-ups with the Harrison house in the background, their breath visible in the frozen air, as they described the mysterious disappearance of a 5-year-old girl from her own backyard. Detective Chen assembled a team of investigators to reconstruct the timeline with forensic precision. They measured distances, timed how long it took to walk from the house to the gate, from the gate to the service road beyond the Greenbelt. They interviewed neighbors again, this time with specific questions about vehicles, strangers, anyone who might have been in the area that Tuesday morning. Mrs. Patricia Carlson, who lived 3 houses down and had been home recovering from knee surgery, told investigators she had been sitting by her front window between 10 and noon, the way she did most mornings. She had seen the mail carrier at 11:15. She had seen a delivery truck turn around in the cul-de-sac at approximately 10:40. She had not seen anyone walking through the neighborhood, no unfamiliar cars, no one running or behaving suspiciously. She had not seen a small girl in purple pants and a pink sweatshirt. The FBI brought in specialists to examine the Harrison home. They processed the backyard like a crime scene, photographing the swing set, the gate, the frozen ground. They found no signs of a struggle, no unfamiliar footprints in the patches of snow. The swing seat was approximately 18 inches off the ground, its chains still. A toy truck lay on its side near the fence, its yellow paint faded from sun exposure. Everything appeared ordinary, undisturbed, except for the absence of the child who should have been there. Clears throat. Inside the house, investigators conducted a methodical search with the family's permission. They examined Emma's room, her clothes, her toys. They looked for any indication that someone had been planning to run away, though the idea of a 5-year-old planning such a thing seemed absurd. They checked the computer's browser history and found nothing alarming. Work-related searches by Michael, recipe websites visited by Jennifer, nothing unusual. They examined the washing machine and dryer, the hamper in the bathroom, looking for any evidence that might suggest something had happened to Emma inside the house and been concealed afterward. They found nothing. Yet as the second day of searching stretched into evening, small discrepancies began to accumulate in investigators' notes. Michael Harrison's timeline, when examined against the phone records and the neighbor's observations, contained what one deputy described as soft spots. Michael said he had done laundry that morning, but Jennifer would later tell Detective Chen that she had done laundry the night before, and the hamper had been empty when she left for work. Michael said he had been checking email when Emma went outside, but the computer's timestamp logs showed no activity between 9:30 and 1:15 that afternoon. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Michael explained them away. Perhaps he had only thought about doing laundry. Perhaps he remembered the wrong morning. Perhaps he had simply looked at the computer without actually using it. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Michael's demeanor. While Jennifer was barely functional, sedated by her doctor and sleeping in a neighbor's guest room because she couldn't bear to be in the house, Michael remained strangely operational. He answered questions, made sandwiches for volunteers, kept Jacob on his normal schedule. When the media asked to interview him, he agreed, sitting on the front steps with his son on his lap, his face composed as he made a direct appeal to whoever might have taken Emma. "Please bring her home," he said, looking directly into the camera. "She's just a little girl. She needs her family." His voice broke only once when he said Emma's name. Some viewers found the appeal heartbreaking. Others found it oddly performative. On day 3, investigators focused on victimology and opportunity. They interviewed everyone who had contact with the Harrison family, daycare workers, preschool teachers, neighbors, relatives, Michael's coworkers, Jennifer's colleagues at the dental office. They constructed a social map of the family's life, looking for anyone who might have had inappropriate interest in Emma, anyone who had shown unusual attention. They found nothing. The Harrisons were described as a normal family, perhaps a bit isolated, not particularly social, but normal. No one could think of anyone who would want to harm Emma. The search radius expanded to 15 miles. Divers checked retention ponds and irrigation ditches. Officers searched abandoned buildings and storage units. The community's efforts intensified rather than waning. Churches organized prayer vigils. Businesses printed flyers with Emma's photograph. Volunteers walked trails and knocked on doors in rural areas outside town. On the evening of day 4, a woman called the tip line to report that she thought she had seen a little girl matching Emma's description at a rest stop near the Wyoming border. Investigators rushed to the location and reviewed security footage. The child in the video was a different girl, older, wearing different clothes. The lead evaporated. Clears throat. By the end of the first week, Detective Chen began to seriously consider what she had been trying not to consider, that something had happened to Emma Harrison inside that house, and that the person responsible was the last person to see her alive. She reviewed Michael's interviews again, listening for the places where his voice changed, where his answers became too precise or too vague. She noticed that he never asked certain questions that parents typically asked. He never asked about ransom demands, never asked if there were any suspects, never asked about evidence being found. It was as if he already knew the answers. On day 9, investigators obtained search warrants to examine the Harrison vehicles. Michael drove a Ford pickup truck, 5 years old, with 92,000 miles on the odometer. Jennifer drove a Honda sedan with 68,000 miles. Both vehicles were processed for evidence, fiber samples, soil samples, any indication they had been used to transport Emma. The results were inconclusive. The truck showed evidence of Michael's work equipment, nothing unusual. The sedan showed normal family detritus, juice box straws, French fries under the seats, a child's sock. But when investigators checked Michael's odometer against his employment records and recent fuel receipts, they found a discrepancy. His odometer showed approximately 30 miles more than it should have based on his documented trips to work and back over the previous month. When Detective Chen asked Michael about the extra miles, he suggested his odometer might be off, or perhaps he had driven somewhere and forgotten. Chen asked him to try to remember. Michael thought for a moment and then said he had driven to a hardware store in Loveland the weekend before Emma disappeared. Investigators checked the store's security footage. Michael's truck did not appear in the parking lot that day. The investigation began to focus more narrowly, though publicly the search for Emma continued. Dive teams searched Rocky Mountain Lake, a reservoir 25 miles west of Fort Collins. Helicopters continued to scan open land. But behind closed doors, in conference rooms at the sheriff's department, investigators were building a different kind of case, a circumstantial case, built on inconsistencies and improbabilities and the slowly hardening belief that Michael Harrison knew exactly where his daughter was. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, you understand the cognitive dissonance, the way your mind rejects the evidence even as it accumulates. Jennifer Harrison was living this nightmare. Her husband of 7 years, the father of her children, was being investigated as a suspect in their daughter's disappearance. Detectives showed her the timeline discrepancies, the odometer readings, the computer records. They asked her about Michael's behavior that day, whether she had noticed anything unusual when she came home. Jennifer wanted to defend him. She tried to defend him. But there were moments when doubt crept in, moments when she replayed the phone call and heard something in his voice she hadn't noticed before. By the 3rd week, the active search had been scaled back. Volunteers still organized weekend expeditions to search new areas, but the official command post had been dismantled. The media coverage decreased. The case remained open, investigators still following leads, but the intensity had diminished. Detectives continued to interview Michael Harrison periodically, hoping he would slip, contradict himself in a way that couldn't be explained. He never did. His story remained consistent. And without a body, without physical evidence, without any witness to contradict his account, prosecutors couldn't build a case strong enough to charge him. Emma Rose Harrison's 5th birthday came and went, marked by a candlelight vigil in the park where she had played on summer evenings. Her mother stood among the crowd, her face hollow with grief, while Michael stood slightly apart, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The swing hung still. The toy truck lay on its side, and the question everyone wanted answered remained suspended in the frozen Colorado air. Where was Emma? Part 3. The Silence. 18 months after Emma disappeared, Jennifer Harrison filed for separation. The court documents cited irreconcilable differences, made no mention of the investigation, included a request for sole custody of Jacob, now nearly 5 years old. The family home on Willow Creek Drive had been sold 8 months earlier at a significant loss. No one wanted to buy the house where the missing girl had lived, where her room still contained her toys and her clothes, and the faint scent of the strawberry shampoo she had used. Michael moved to an apartment complex on the south side of Fort Collins. Jennifer moved with Jacob to her mother's house in Denver, 2 hours away, seeking distance from the neighborhood where everyone recognized her face, where every trip to the grocery store meant sympathetic looks and whispered conversations. The separation was quiet, processed through lawyers, no dramatic confrontations. Jennifer's attorney advised her to be careful about what she said regarding her suspicions about Michael. Legally speaking, she could be sued for slander if she accused him without proof. So she stayed silent in public, but those close to her saw the toll it took. Her sister would later describe Jennifer during this period as hollowed out, a woman going through the motions of living while carrying unbearable weight. She worked part-time again, dropped Jacob at school, picked him up, made dinner, helped with homework, put him to bed. The routine of mothering one child while grieving another created a strange doubling effect. Every milestone with Jacob was also a reminder of Emma at that age. Every school event one more occasion she would never attend for her daughter. Jacob himself carried scars from that January morning, though he had been too young to understand what was happening at the time. He remembered the police in the house, remembered his mother crying, remembered the lady with the kind voice who had stayed with him while grown-ups talked in other rooms. As he grew older and started school, other children would sometimes ask about his sister, having heard the story from their parents. Jacob learned to say that his sister was gone, and he didn't know where she was, a rehearsed answer that spared him from having to explain the unexplainable. Clears throat. Michael Harrison, meanwhile, maintained his innocence in the rare occasions when anyone asked him directly. He returned to work, kept to himself, became someone his colleagues described as damaged but functional. He never remarried, never dated as far as anyone could tell. He exercised his court-mandated visitation rights with Jacob every other weekend, picking him up Friday evening and returning him Sunday night, their exchanges with Jennifer taking place in public parking lots with minimal conversation. What father and son talked about during those weekends, no one knew. Jennifer asked Jacob if his father ever mentioned Emma, and Jacob said yes, sometimes. They looked at pictures together. This information both comforted and disturbed her. What was Michael trying to accomplish by showing Jacob photos of a sister who had vanished? The case remained officially open but effectively dormant. Detective Chen had retired in 2008, moving to Arizona to be near her daughter's family. The case files sat in storage at the sheriff's department, several boxes containing witness statements, search reports, photographs, evidence bags with Emma's belongings. New investigators would occasionally review the file, hoping to see something their predecessors had missed, but the conclusion was always the same. Strong suspicion, insufficient evidence, no body, no case. For those who have ever lived under the weight of unresolved tragedy, You know how it changes the architecture of daily life. Simple things become complicated. Jennifer couldn't watch certain television shows because a child's laugh sounded too much like Emma's. She avoided playgrounds where girls Emma's age were swinging and running. She kept Emma's room at her mother's house exactly as it had been, her stuffed animals arranged on the bed, her clothes folded in drawers, a shrine to a child frozen forever at 5 years old. Her mother gently suggested, years later, that it might be healthier to pack those things away, and Jennifer reacted with such rage that the subject was never raised again. In 2015, 12 years after Emma's disappearance, Jacob was in therapy. His counselor had noticed signs of anxiety, nightmares, difficulty concentrating in school, a tendency to ask repeatedly about locked doors and windows. During one session when Jacob was 14, the therapist asked if he remembered anything about the day his sister disappeared. Jacob said he didn't really, he had been too little. But then he was quiet for a long moment before adding that he sometimes had a dream about that day, the same dream over and over. In the dream, he was in his bed for his nap, but he wasn't really asleep. He heard his dad's voice outside the window, talking to someone, and then he heard a car door close. When the therapist asked if he thought the dream was a memory or just a dream, Jacob said he didn't know, but it felt real. The therapist documented this conversation in her notes and, with Jennifer's permission, contacted the Larimer County Sheriff's Department. A detective interviewed Jacob, but the teenager couldn't provide any additional details. He didn't remember what his father's voice sounded like in the dream, couldn't say what was being said, couldn't describe the sound of the car door closing beyond saying it was a heavy sound, like a bigger vehicle. The detective thanked him and noted the information in the case file, but it wasn't enough to reopen an active investigation. Dreams were not evidence. Clears throat. By 2020, 17 years had passed. Jennifer was 46 years old, her dark blonde hair now streaked with gray. Jacob was 20, attending community college in Denver, living in his own apartment. The anniversary of Emma's disappearance still appeared in local news broadcasts each January. The story retold briefly, Emma's photograph shown on screen. Always the same picture from the Christmas before she vanished. A little girl with blue eyes and a gap-toothed smile wearing a red velvet dress. The public remembering had become ritualistic, devoid of hope. Everyone assumed Emma was gone forever, that her body was somewhere it would never be found, that her father would take his secret to his grave. Michael Harrison was 50, still working as a telecommunications technician, still living alone in Fort Collins, though he had moved to a different apartment. He looked older than his years, his hair fully gray, his face deeply lined. Neighbors in his building described him as polite but withdrawn, someone who kept odd hours and rarely had visitors. His brother, who lived in Kansas, told anyone who asked that Michael was innocent, that he had been destroyed by suspicion and judgment, that losing his daughter and then being accused of harming her had broken something fundamental in him. Whether this was true or whether it was the performance of a guilty man who had gotten away with something, no one could say for certain. The marriage between Jennifer and Michael had been legally dissolved in 2007, the final decree granting Jennifer full custody of Jacob, with Michael retaining visitation rights. By the time Jacob turned 18, he had begun to decline his father's invitations to visit. The last time they saw each other was Jacob's high school graduation in 2018. Michael had sat alone in the auditorium, watching his son cross the stage to receive his diploma, and afterward had approached to offer congratulations. Jacob had shaken his hand formally, the way you might shake hands with a distant acquaintance, and then returned to his mother's side. The years had created a kind of scar tissue over the wound, not healing exactly, but dulling the sharpest edges of pain. Jennifer went to grief counseling, joined a support group for parents of missing children, eventually became a volunteer advocate for families navigating similar nightmares. She spoke at conferences about the importance of continued investigation into cold cases, about keeping hope alive while also learning to live with uncertainty. She never said publicly what she believed had happened to Emma, but those who knew her best understood that she carried both grief for her daughter and suspicion of her former husband in equal measure. And then in August 2023, everything changed. Part 4, The Revelation. The call came to Detective Raymond Torres on a Wednesday afternoon. Torres was a cold case investigator who had joined the Larimer County Sheriff's Department in 2019 and had spent considerable time reviewing unsolved cases from the past 2 decades. The Emma Harrison file was one he returned to periodically, reading through the old interviews, studying the timeline, convinced that the answer was hidden somewhere in those pages. The caller was a woman named Patricia Hughes, a former neighbor of Michael Harrison's from an apartment complex where he had lived between 2008 and 2014. Patricia Hughes told Detective Torres that she had been thinking about something for years and could no longer keep it to herself. In the summer of 2012, she explained, she had lived in the apartment below Michael's. She often heard him moving around upstairs, footsteps, furniture scraping, the normal sounds of someone living above you. But one night in July, around 2 in the morning, she had been awakened by different sounds. Heavy objects being moved, something dragging, the unmistakable sound of his truck starting in the parking lot below her window. She had looked out and seen Michael loading something large wrapped in a tarp into the bed of his truck. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. People moved furniture at odd hours, got rid of old things, whatever. But over the years, particularly after she learned about the missing daughter, the memory had bothered her. Torres asked why she hadn't come forward earlier. Patricia said she had convinced herself it was nothing, that she was reading meaning into something innocent. And besides, it had been 9 years after the girl disappeared. What could it possibly have to do with anything? But now she was older, her own daughter had children, and the thought that she might know something, even something small, and not share it felt wrong. Torres thanked her, took detailed notes, and began the process of confirming her story. She had indeed lived at that address during that time period. Michael Harrison had lived in the apartment above hers from 2008 to 2014. The apartment complex still had records. Clears throat. Torres began pulling together everything he could about Michael's movements in 2012. Where had he worked? Where might he have driven at 2 in the morning with something large wrapped in a tarp? Torres obtained phone records from that period, credit card statements, employment records. On the morning of July 18, 2012, Michael had called in to work saying he was ill and wouldn't be coming in. His phone pinged off cell towers that day in a pattern that showed movement west from Fort Collins into the mountains, specifically in the area around Powder Canyon. Torres drove the route himself, studying the terrain, noting the turnoffs, the places where someone could leave a main road and disappear into forest land. In September 2023, Torres presented his findings to the district attorney's office. He had no direct evidence linking Michael to Emma's death, but he now had a potential location where remains might be found and a witness who had seen suspicious behavior. The DA authorized a new search operation in Powder Canyon, focusing on areas accessible from the main road, but remote enough that something hidden there might remain undiscovered for years. Teams of searchers, including forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs, spent 2 weeks combing through forest land along the canyon road. On October 3, 2023, at a location approximately 40 miles from Fort Collins, searchers found what they had been looking for. Buried in a shallow grave beneath layers of pine needles and decomposed leaves were the skeletal remains of a child approximately 5 years old. The remains were clothed in fragments of fabric that included purple corduroy material and pink fleece. A small boot, still intact, was recovered near the remains, a purple snow boot, child size 10. The positive identification came through dental records on October 10, 2023. The remains were those of Emma Rose Harrison. The forensic pathologist couldn't determine cause of death due to the condition of the remains, but the fact that they had been buried, that they had been concealed, spoke to consciousness of guilt. On October 12, Detective Torres and 2 other investigators arrived at Michael Harrison's apartment at 6 in the morning. They knocked on the door and waited. When Michael opened it, still in his sleep clothes, Torres showed him the arrest warrant. "Michael Harrison, you're under arrest for the death of your daughter, Emma Rose Harrison." Michael's face, witnesses would later say, showed no surprise. He simply nodded, asked if he could get dressed, was told yes, but that an officer would accompany him to ensure he didn't flee or harm himself. He changed into jeans and a flannel shirt, moving with careful precision, and then held out his hands for the handcuffs. As he was led to the patrol car, neighbors watched from windows and doorways. One woman began to cry, though she couldn't have said whether the tears were for Emma, for Michael, or for the terrible weight of truth finally emerging into daylight. The news spread rapidly. By noon, every major news outlet in Colorado was reporting the arrest. Jennifer Harrison, reached by phone at her home in Denver, said simply, "I knew." When pressed for more, she added, "I've known for 20 years, I just couldn't prove it." Jacob, now 23, released a brief statement through his mother's attorney. "I hope my sister can finally rest in peace. Our family will have no further comment at this time." Clears throat. The community's reaction was divided. Those who had always suspected Michael felt vindicated, but also horrified that it had taken 2 decades to confirm what they had believed. Others, particularly Michael's family members, insisted the evidence was circumstantial, that the discovery of Emma's remains didn't prove Michael had killed her, only that she had been buried in a remote location. His brother hired a defense attorney who immediately began preparing for trial, arguing that Patricia Hughes's testimony about events 13 years earlier was unreliable, that the investigation had been biased against Michael from the beginning, that the real perpetrator might have been someone else entirely who had later moved Emma's remains to that canyon location. The preliminary hearing in November 2023 drew media attention from across the country. The case had become a symbol, another missing child, another parent suspected but not charged for years, another example of how difficult it is to prosecute crimes without bodies, without witnesses, without clear evidence. Detective Torres testified about the investigation, both the original one in 2003 and the renewed effort in 2023. Patricia Hughes testified about what she had seen that night in 2012. The forensic anthropologist testified about the remains, the clothing fragments, the boot. Michael's defense attorney argued that none of this proved Michael had killed Emma in 2003, that the timeline between Emma's disappearance and the burial could have involved other parties, that reasonable doubt existed at every turn. The judge found sufficient evidence to bind Michael over for trial. Bail was set at $2 million, an amount Michael couldn't meet. He remained in custody at the Larimer County Jail, held in isolation for his own protection. Crimes against children are not tolerated even among those accused of other terrible acts. The trial was scheduled for March 2024. In January 2024, 3 days before jury selection was set to begin, Michael Harrison's attorney requested a meeting with the district attorney. What transpired in that meeting was not made public immediately. But the next day, the DA's office announced that Michael Harrison had agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 40 years, without possibility of parole. He would also provide a full confession detailing what had happened to Emma. The confession, delivered in a closed session with only attorneys, the judge and court reporters present, was later summarized in court documents. Michael Harrison admitted that on the morning of January 15, 2003, he and Emma had gotten into an argument about something trivial. She wanted to watch a different television program. He said no. She threw a tantrum. He said he grabbed her arm to make her sit down and she pulled away, stumbled, hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. He said he panicked when he realized she wasn't breathing, that he tried CPR but couldn't revive her. He said he couldn't call for help because he knew everyone would think he had hurt her on purpose, so he made the decision to hide what had happened. He said he put Emma's body in a storage container in the garage and called 911 to report her missing. He said he manufactured the story about the backyard and the swing and the open gate. He said he participated in the searches, knowing they would never find her. He said he kept her body hidden in the garage behind boxes of tools and Christmas decorations for 9 years, until he moved apartments and realized he needed to do something permanent. He said he drove to Powder Canyon on that July night in 2012 and buried his daughter in a place he thought no one would ever find. When asked why he was confessing now, Michael said he was tired. "I've been carrying this for 20 years," he said. "I'm ready for it to be over." Jennifer Harrison attended the sentencing hearing on February 14, 2024. She sat in the front row of the courtroom, Jacob beside her, and listened as the judge accepted Michael's guilty plea and imposed the agreed-upon sentence. When given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, Jennifer stood and faced the man she had married, the man who had fathered her children, the man who had looked her in the eye every day for 18 months after Emma disappeared and lied. "You took everything," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. "You took my daughter, you took my trust. You took 20 years of not knowing, of hopping against hope that maybe she was still alive somewhere. You could have told the truth on day one. You could have spared me decades of wondering. But you chose yourself over everyone else, and now you'll spend the rest of your life living with that choice." Michael Harrison, standing at the defense table in an orange jail uniform, kept his eyes on the floor and said nothing. Closing. On a cold February afternoon, Emma Rose Harrison was finally laid to rest in a cemetery on the outskirts of Denver, 21 years after she disappeared from her backyard. The headstone is simple white marble with her name, her birth date, and the date she died, January 15, 2003, finally acknowledged after 2 decades of questions. Her mother planted rose bushes on either side of the grave, the kind that bloom pink in summer, the color Emma loved best. The case stands as a reminder that some truths take years to surface, that justice delayed is still justice, that a 5-year-old girl who vanished on a winter morning deserves to be remembered not as a mystery, but as a child who was loved and whose absence left a wound that could never fully heal. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.